Okay, so I think people are coming back. So let's just wait for another 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll have a like a summary of the two breakout sessions. Might be we'll go with the second one. Anant has a hard constraint at 4:10, so might be he will Anant and Michael might be Anant will get started, and then we'll see Michael can continue. Anant, please feel
Yeah,
free to share the
sure,
Google
sure.
Doc or in whatever way you want to summarize.
Yeah, sure. So, just a quick summary of our breakout room. So the topic at hand that we were entrusted to discuss was around AI, machine learning, um, and challenges, opportunities, roadblocks. We spent most of the conversation really talking about some of um, the roadblocks and some of the challenges. And so maybe I'll start at the top here. So the first question that we started to tackle was identifying scientific, technical, general, that is organizational training roadblocks for widespread use of AI and ML as it applies to computational pathology. And I think one of the first things that I guess the distinction that emerged was focusing and targeting who that question is being directed to. So when you talk about challenges, roadblocks, the distinction was made that we have to think about the research community differently from the pathology community. And so that was one of the first things that came up because it was also appreciated. We had folks in our group that were coming into AI and machine learning for pathology from a different background. Some folks who were coming at it from a radiology background, a medical image analysis background. And so there was an appreciation that there are going to be challenges and roadblocks for the research community as well, folks who worked in this space in AI machine learning, but not necessarily in pathology. So I think that was one of the first distinctions made. One of the other topics that we talked about was, if you think of the pathologist as the end user and the consumer of these technologies, what are the potential challenges for adoption of these tools by the pathologist? And one of the questions that came up was trying to understand, to what extent does infrastructure play a role in adoption of these tools? So if you have the pathologist sitting in a pathology cockpit, then it's not simply about the use of the tools, you've got to build a cockpit, right? So there was a sense that if you've got the pathologist there and to truly enable the pathologist to use the tools, you might actually have to think about creating the entire cockpit. In other words, creating the entire end-to-end digital pathology workflow in order to enable the use of the AI tools. The point was also made that if you think of a non-pathologist as the end user or consumer of the technology, so in other words, if you think of computational pathology from a prognostic predictive standpoint, then maybe your end user or consumer is not the pathologist as much as it is, say, the oncologist. And the point was made that if you look at some of these molecular tools like Oncotype DX and so on, they've had a history of, to some extent, bypassing the pathologist and directly marketing to the oncologist. So the oncologist becomes sort of the dominant person who's in the middle of the ecosystem. And in that particular setting, this whole end-to-end pathology workflow, digital pathology workflow, becomes less relevant, because the way Oncotype and Genomic Health have set up their operations have been through these sort of CLIA-based labs where you would ship the specimen to those labs, the analysis is done, and then the result comes back to the oncologist. So you could envision a scenario where if the oncologist is at the center of the equation, you could have a similar setup where you've got a startup or a company that's, accepts the images, accepts the data, generates the interpretation, sends it back to the oncologist. I think that there were the other points that came up was on from the perspective of the pathologist. We had a few pathologists in the room. An appreciation, there's certain burden that's going to be placed on the pathologist to select the right algorithm, knowing how to decide when potentially down the road you're going to have hundreds of algorithms. So at least one of the challenges with the deployment of these tools is you you could have a situation where the pathologist has to figure out, with not a great deal of know-how or expertise or information, which of a variety of tools that might be available should be the one to invoke for a given problem. So this was also brought up as sort of one of the potential challenges, issue with integration of these AI tools with the pathologist. There was also a conversation around quality assurance and quality assessment. There was the point made that we're during some of the conversations we've had thus far, we've sort of assumed that the quality of the data going in is going to be pretty kosher. That the fidelity of the slides is fine from a computational standpoint. That might not always be the case. And so the point was made that we have to think about quality assurance upfront, and that we need to really think about the fact that the slides have to be analyzed for quality prior to having the AI ingest the slides and spitting out an interpretation. One of the other points that also emerged is that if you want to enable AI for pathology, you also have to think of additional investments. It's not just investment in whole slide scanning or investment in the technology or buying the tools. You're going to have to make institutional investments in additional FTEs to enable the process. The slides are not going to automatically digitize themselves. This is not radiology where you're getting inherently digital data coming off the CT or the MRI scanners. We're talking about a process where you start with a slide, that slide has to be digitized. And so that means there has to be a human in the loop to enable the transference from analog to digital prior to application of these AI tools. And so from the get-go, there has to be an institutional commitment to want to invest in that additional FTE, because that process, particularly if you're talking about having the digitization on-prem, there has to be a commitment at an institutional level that you're going to have to not just buy the machine, you're going to have to invest in individuals as well for that process. There was also a discussion around the pharma perspective. One of the questions that Mike had brought up to Jason during Jason's talk was about, what would you choose? Would you choose different algorithms? Would you choose more data? What would be, if you had your bucket list, what would you want to put in there? And so we had representation from pharma in our breakout room, and it's interesting that there was a conversation, a discussion around what happens when you've got a lot of data, when you don't have that much data, and thinking about different strategies and different approaches in the context of different volumes of data. And so there was a discussion around supervised approaches, unsupervised approaches, looking at things like embeddings where you could do discoveries from the data without the need for manual annotations. And there was recognition also that the annotation piece is also another bottleneck, particularly with developing, validating these AI algorithms. So it was thought that if you don't have deeply annotated data, or if that's too expensive to generate, then you could also think about approaches like embeddings, like TSNE, UMAP, and so on, that could allow for a more unbiased sort of wrangling of the data that could help reveal certain patterns. So there was a conversation around that. We talked briefly around steps for clinical validation. Like I said, there was a discussion around data quality and making sure that the data was QC'd prior to shipping it over to the ML algorithms. And then maybe Mike, do you want to take over? You posed that really nice question about what are the kinds of tools that are shovel ready for clinical deployment. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion about the bottleneck that the LIS companies currently have us in, but not enough discussion about the way to work around that with things like FHIR implementations. So I'd love to see this group, the Midwest Consortium group, with the robust attendee list, to actually ask about AI implementations at sites, map to the LIS, and map to what the innovator partner company is doing. there's a lot of hope that we could have a voice that might matter to the LIS community, but I remain sanguine about that, particularly because the stovepipe technologies that the laboratory information systems currently operate on. So this is a development environment and not a implement and deploy environment, despite the significant amount of money we pay out to the LIS companies to support our current technologies. And until we get the right voice and influence in place, they're largely gonna, yawn at us as developers to implement kind of meaning to practice. So that's where I see the power in industry-sponsored research and in the environment in which we as developers really make a difference for patients and cancer centers and pathology departments that care. So my roadmap is we've got to influence our cancer centers, we've got to influence our pathology leadership, and we've got to influence our partnering associations like the CAP, like ASCP, like the Association for Pathology Informatics, to really put meaning to action instead of the lightweight focus that there is more in maintaining our member organizations than making a difference with our member organizations. And that's a challenge that, we have to raise ourselves up to doing. And hopefully maybe Midwest Consortium can be a lever in that regard. I'd be curious to hear from Anil what his intention with the Midwest Consortium and other leadership with the Midwest Consortium. Where do they want to make a difference?
I think the consortium, the goal is to, like, when I think about it, the reason why I got into the consortium as a pathologist is when I look at my colleagues in computer science and bioinformatics and other areas, when I speak to Raghu and DK and Lee and others, we need to come together as a community because pathology has needs, pathology has problems. And I think if we can explain these needs to computer scientists and the big data scientists and people who do this analysis, I think we can converge together to find solutions. So the goal of the consortium is really to bring all of us together to start thinking about what do we do with this big data? How can we solve the problems for the everyday pathologist? So I don't know if DK or Raghu or Lee, you want to chime in.
No, I think Anil, you said it, summarized it very well. I mean, I think over the years, like myself, Raghu, and others, several of us have been talking with you and Lee. So we see, I mean, there is a requirement from pathologists, and we have some solutions and techniques. So we need to bridge the gap. I think that is one of the primary objective of this consortium, so that we can come together as a community and then try to see what has been done, what needs to be done, and where things are practical or what cannot be done. So over this series of workshops, I am hoping that we'll be able to achieve these objectives.
I just want to chime in just for a second here. I just want to commend Raghu, Anil, and Dhavleshwar and others for pulling this meeting together. I think this is something that was sorely needed. So thank you for having taken the initiative to pull this together. The other piece that I just want to throw in here is that there's a lot of activity and recognition also at a state level, and I'm talking about the state of Ohio here, around technology. And so, Anil, Raghu and others, you might be aware that Mike DeWine yesterday announced, nearly over $500 million in funding to create an innovation district in Cleveland. And this is built off the back of the innovation district that have been set up in Cincinnati. And I think that there are going to be similar announcements about innovation districts in other parts of Ohio. But there's a big focus around, technology, biomedical technology, AI. This was a big press release that came out last night at 5 p.m. So, Cleveland Clinic is going to be, involved. A lot of that initial money is going to focus around creating a pathogen center, but artificial intelligence, biomedical technology is being called out, and particularly its convergence with medicine. So it's very exciting time, and I would also just throw out there that it's an opportunity for us to think, collaboratively, think about, also funding opportunities to pursue and sort of work more closely together.
That'll be great, Anil. Yeah, thanks for letting us know about this innovation districts. Yeah.
So might be if there are no further discussion on this breakout session, so let's hear back from Jeffrey and Jane. Do you one of you would like to summarize, and then we'll conclude?
I guess I can. Are you going?
Oh, you go.
So we were just talking about the roadblocks for adoption of digital pathology and image analysis for other hospitals, smaller hospitals, and even other academic institutions, and what are some of the roadblocks. And really, Anil put it best that the glass slide is our biggest barrier. Unlike radiology, where it was easy to adopt image technology because you got rid of the film, we're still stuck with having the glass slide and having that to be made. So it's sort of this culture barrier of having the institution and larger structure understand that it's an investment. It's a large amount of money that's needed for this investment, and it can be hard to show a sort of return on investment initially, but after overcoming the initial culture and money barrier, the next steps are still significant, but sort of able to be overcome. So it's sort of trying to figure out, and I think that with the consortium of having a group to help understand and advocate for one another is some of the solutions that are needed. And we sort of hit on what Dr. Becich had sort of also mentioned, that these large LIS companies sort of push us to the side as far as sort of having the adoption between the digital slide and the LIS, because that also is a big investment of FTEs, of having to manually type in information versus having a barcode information, sort of organize that very quickly into the LIS, but that is a technical barrier. So those were sort of the first initial discussion points we had. I don't know if Jeff, you want to add in anything else to that first discussion point?
I think the biggest, we talk about what's the biggest barrier, and it's a little bit financial and it's a little bit institutional. Like about the need to have a champion and to convince the institution. And I think, as was mentioned by Anant, that we have this need it's not just for like the box. You also need staff, you need LIS integration. And so this can't just be a sort of a one-off. Do you want to talk about, Jen, do you want to talk about the sort of synergy or
Yeah.
comparison to molecular?
So our sort of second discussion point was trying to understand of, how do you take this multi-data approach and bring it all together with the clinical, the pathologic, and sort of high sequence output. And I think that one of the, again, sort of barriers in all of this is also having different, ways in which we don't have a standard basically with our digital slides, first of all, and that can create problems. And then sort of the other aspect is, how do we approach and advocate for ourselves with having the amount of storage, local storage versus cloud storage, and sort of understanding all of these approaches is sort of what makes it difficult to just take this generated data and bring it all together. We talked about how the molecular pipeline in both radiology has a little bit easier situation with having one sort of standard, and we're moving towards that with a DICOM standard. But I think these are sort of the aspects that challenge us in bringing all of this information together in a more seamless manner.
Are there any other summary need to be reported from the other session?
I think there was a great summary by Jen and Jeff. I was in that session, so I think there was a lot of good discussion, and I think there was a good discussion about all these topics that were covered by the speaker. So it was really very, very good to talk about these points, because these are real challenges that we face across the board in pathology. So one of the goals will be to really, in the next couple of days, to focus on these problems and try to come up with solutions. And maybe we won't get all the solutions in this workshop, but we'll at least find ways to come together